Hi, my name is Dr. Nicole Bojko, and this is Celebrity Chat, and today we'll be chatting with Dr. Ian Dixon. So can you introduce yourself and talk about your affiliation and some of your more recent work?
Absolutely. I'm Dr. Ian Dixon. Thank you, Doctor. I am affiliated with the SAE Institute in Australia. We have 52 campuses around the world, 7 of them in Australia, and we're a creative industries school, but we do cultural studies as well. So there is a very slight activist component, and really it's me that's kind of leading that in the cultural studies arena. But in terms of introducing myself, I am a filmmaker. I've been a director of television. You might know Neigbours from Australia. I used to direct that. I also have feature films in rotation, and I've been an actor for 30 years, but I just stopped last year because I've had enough. That's where my activism is.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
And goodbye.
But so today I have the pleasure to talk to you about one of your passions for research, John Cassavetes. And so one thing that we really wanted to talk about today was Cassavetes and activism. So before we get into that, right, the notion of activism is complex. And so oftentimes in the U.S. we think of it as very politicized with celebrities fighting for marginalized people. But also, do you understand it in that way, or is there a way that you think more of activism?
Look, let's go straight to Cassavetes on that matter, because I think whatever your definition of activism, it is going to have gradations, and rather than me try and second guess our audience at home, it would be better for me to start talking about what I believe he is doing as activism. And I think the essential thing about Cassavetes is he's not actually claiming to be part of any movement. He found it anathema that people would say, oh, you're left-wing, or oh, you're right-wing, and he was accused of both. He was certainly accused of being middle America. He was certainly by Pauline Kael accused of being sexist, misogynist, boysy with a film made in 1970 called Husbands. Well, what I find interesting is the feminist interest in his film A Woman Under the Influence. Because as we talk about activism, then we are also talking about giving a voice to the marginalized. So he took the cross-section of two marginalized people in 1974, of course, women's labor, women's role in the home, and the role of mental illness and how it was perceived and otherated during the 1970s. So he combined these two in the figure of his wife. Now, his illumination of filmic ideas always came down to, what does the actor bring to this role? When his wife played a prostitute, because he always worked with Gena Rowlands, his wife. When she played a prostitute in 1968, he said, well, what's your idea of it? And she said the silk negligees, and it was an idea that some have accused him of being completely devoid of the reality of the sex worker. Well, when it came to the position of mental illness, and you'll notice during the conference I spoke about mental illness, because he never specified it. He never said what this was, and he was criticized, just as he was criticized for the structure of his films. And yet, his idea was to illuminate the central thematic idea from the inside, usually from the inside of character, because he had a great respect for people and a great respect for character itself. Elaine May, who is a wonderful filmmaker and directed Cassavetes, was still very plot point orientated, and he said, I think the quote was something like, you know what, screw plot point, because it's got nothing to do with the way people live their lives. And so he looked at, how do we imagine and dramatize the experience of life for a mentally ill woman who is trying to be normal, who is loved by her mother, but not liked by her mother, who is loved by, and I'm really quoting from Cassavetes here, who is loved by her husband, but not liked by her husband because she doesn't fit the social role that was meant for her, the good, dutiful mother. She tries, and she's just a little bit too eccentric to fit into that until she goes into a full-blown crisis of psychosis, and that's after she's been institutionalized. He's been majorly criticized, But what's important is the groundswell of opinion that came about that film. Women loved the film.
Mm-hmm.
The French had been loving Cassavetes since Shadows in 1960, so he'd had 14 years of being championed by France. His films distributed in England. America didn't want to know him. America was too offended.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's where the celebrity interface with activism is really interesting with Cassavetes, because he himself was accused of being Middle America. Even at the Venice Film Festival, he was booed for being too middle-brow, too centre. I mean, a lot of people talk of him as left-wing,
mm-hmm.
but as far as the Europeans at a time when the agenda of communism was still very high,
mm-hmm.
was not enough for Venice Film Festival. And students, where he often distributed his films, were critical of his films. And yet, the women loved that film. As Peter Falk, one of his actors, said, it was the women's movement that film rode upon. He received letters from fans who said, "You're describing my life. Thank you for giving me a voice."
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned to you earlier, Molly Haskell, second-wave feminist critic, was pleased with the film, but disappointed that it had to be a man that made the film. And I think that tells us something about the agency of women in the era,
mm-hmm.
particularly given some of the papers we've heard during the conference, which is about how women's agency was rising and then just got quashed again by the mid-70s. So, that's an approach to how I see it. Illuminate the central idea, and because he had a love of the human being, he did actually bring in a lot of marginalized culture. He had a lot of African-American actors in his films, even in Woman Under the Influence.
Mm-hmm.
And his very first debut film, of course, had 3 African-American leads. That's a big, big thing. In my country, in Australia, to have an Aboriginal lead in a white-made film is not unheard of, but is very, very rare.
So it's interesting because it seems like oftentimes when you talk about activism, someone has a cause and they really want to promote whatever the cause is or whatever their feelings are. But with Cassavetes, it almost seems like he's choosing topics that are of interest to him. And then it's like he's thrown into the limelight as an activist. And would you say that that's what he was doing? He wasn't really an activist pursuing a cause type of way, but he chose what was interesting to him, and it happened to be hot button topics.
Well said. You should be a Cassavetes scholar, because as Raymond Carney has quoted Cassavetes as saying, the form is in the content.
Mm-hmm.
So if he's illuminating something that steps out of your life,
mm-hmm.
then your issues are going to come forward, and naturally they assume the work of activism.
Mm-hmm.
Not that there aren't some pretty shallow pro-American ideas in his films, but that he was a man of extremes.
Mm-hmm.
God rest his soul, he died from extreme alcohol abuse,
mm-hmm.
or so it is surmised, cirrhosis of the liver.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a chain smoker and a heavy drinker, and a lot of the culture around his films centered on the experience, as Australian theorist George Cavara says, on the experience of being an alcoholic and being drunk.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that indicates something far beyond alcohol, and I certainly concentrate on this in my research, is he had the ability to inhabit extremes. So if you gave him a mentally ill housewife in 1974, he would take it to an
mm-hmm.
extreme, and therefore he was dramatizing ideas on screen that were far more important,
mm-hmm.
far braver than anything that mainstream Hollywood was doing at the time. Not that I'm separating him from Hollywood. He did live in LA. He did make his first film in New York. But he had a voice, and he believed in the voice of the individual. Now, if that individual that he was studying, that he loved, and he always loved the people, I think that is something for young filmmakers to emulate. Don't forget, we got to love our crews, love our actors, love our people.
Mm-hmm.
My God, I just made a film, part of a feature film called The Perimeter, which had my wife on the crew, my daughter in the film,
mm-hmm.
and all the time I'm thinking, am I living up to the spirit of you, Johnny? Please step on my set and tell me And he came down and said, "This is awful, I hate it." So, what can you do? But the point is, with extremes, he was a brave man. He was prepared. He was a maverick, as Raymond Carney likes to describe him. He put himself out there, and he was not afraid to push his actors much further into the experience of what they were describing than even they expected to be.
And so, as we were kind of running out of time, but thinking about Cassavetes and thinking about, modern times, like, how would you...
I thought that was Charlie Chaplin.
No, that's true.
It's just a joke for people at home. Sorry. Yes.
But
cut that
out. But thinking about how to keep him modern, or how to apply him to, the current situation in filmmaking, or how would you go about that if you were...
Look, I think as much as it might be seen as privilege in itself, particularly the paper that we've just heard, the interesting fact about Cassavetes is you ask the general populace, who's John Cassavetes? They don't know, unless they've seen The Notebook and they're confusing him with his son. But of course, that was even based on an idea of John Cassavetes. But what we have is... a split, you can edit that pause out, a split in the perception of Cassavetes, because everyone who's ever been through any film school in the world not only knows but adores John Cassavetes. Many students that I've taught, they want to do Cassavetes. I want to do Cassavetes. Of course, I wouldn't be so pretentious to say I'm anywhere near the level of excellence that his films are, but that rough cinema verite quality that he brought, that ability to look at social issues and really look at them, not just give us a woman's weepy, but to use the woman's weepy form to make a seminal classic like Woman Under the Influence, means that every industry person keeps saying it's about the audience, we're pandering to the audience, and we've heard some of the prejudices that come against activism and against original filmmaking through this conference. So here we have a bunch of people around the world who are dying to do something approaching Cassavetes, who are dying to actually embrace some kind of real social agenda. And then they get out into the industry, and the first thing they hear from their producers is, what's the audience? Who's the audience? Now, yes, of course, I'm a teacher in a film school. I know we have to consider this. I write genre films, but I write genre films because I've 10 years, for the first 10 years, I tried to do social films. I had a very feminist and anti-racist agenda from a very early age. But you keep getting this in the industry. So I started to write genre, and that's just one filmmaker's journey. What about all those students out there who want to do something that's passionate, that's real, that has activism? We know from as early as Dr. Goebbels' film just how powerful film is for changing people's point of view. How can we as academics bridge that gap? This is the conference, it's bridging gaps. How can we bridge that gap between the passionate activism that the student wants to make and the industry that just keeps saying no, when we know from research that the audience do want vegetables, not just ice cream?
That's a good question.
Cool. What's the answer?
That will have to be another chat. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Yes.
That was fun.
Thank you.